All right, guys, let's talk a little bit about deficit deadlifts. This is one of my favorite exercises. It's something I even like to use as a primary exercise oftentimes. And the main reason I like to use it as a primary sometimes is because it's more difficult than a normal deadlift. And whatever you can pull in a deficit, from that weaker position, you will almost always be able to pull on a bad day. Like you could be having a really bad day, and if you a week ago pulled something on a deficit, you will be able to pull it on a normal deadlift. Particularly, we start changing bars around, and furthermore, you'll be able to pull it and grip it. In other words, if you can grip it on the deficit, which is harder on your grip because of the force production time involved, and usually the duration of the pull, you've got it for sure when you pull off of a normal pull off the floor. And for those who don't know what a deficit deadlift is, that is when you stand on something. In this case, I'm standing on a 1-inch plate, which is 2.5 centimeters for those who don't use freedom units. And again, that's just what a standard road calibrated plate is. And that's how much further you are from the floor. And so by doing that, you add that additional range of motion to the bottom, which is generally the most difficult part of the deadlift. Now, something I'm going to disagree with on this, I'm going to get into the hypertrophy side of why it's great for hypertrophy. One of the things I do slightly disagree with, and this is where I agree with Tom Martin, who broke an open deadlift world record and is a good coach, a guy I know from the UK, because we talked about this many years ago. And he agrees on this. The deficit deadlift is actually better for lockout strength than it is improving strength off the floor. You do get people who say, oh, it's good for getting the weight off the floor. Not really. Because if you're sticking off the floor, you are usually sticking just a couple inches off the floor. You should probably either build the muscles involved with that, or you should practice pulling with less leg drag, which means just a hair higher up. Off of a low pin, off of a low block, actually tends to do better for that if you're going to do an assistance. In this case, because you're pulling for a longer duration, it makes you sustain the rate of force production longer. And it's very similar to how the closed grip bench press can help your bench press lock out. It's quite similar in the reasons for it. But I digress. Back to the point. One of the reasons I really like it, though, is the added range of motion. All right, so when we start talking hypertrophy, because a lot of people will say, hey, look, hypertrophy, which again is muscle growth for those who don't know lifting terminology, all right, muscle growth, or like the deadlift isn't the best lift because it's kind of a partial. Most of the muscles are not really going through their full range of motion, so on and so forth, right? And even full range of motion actually isn't as relevant as people believe it is for gaining muscle. It's the lengthened position. It's putting tension in the lengthened positions of muscles, right? So if you're adding range of motion on one end versus another, it may or may not matter. But in this case, where are we adding range of motion? Well, for a lot of the muscles involved, we're adding range of motion towards the lengthened end of the position, okay? Not where they're contracted, but where they're stretched. So in other words, they get stretched a little more, things like your hamstrings, glutes, all that, right? Those big primary movers. Glutes and the hamstrings are the primary movers in the deadlift. A lot of other muscles are very important stabilizers. Quads are a primary mover to a lesser extent. But really those glutes and hamstrings, they get hit a little harder there. And actually the quads do too, but I wouldn't really consider the deadlift the best quad exercise for obvious reasons. It contributes, it does contribute though. But the thing is, we're adding range of motion into the lengthened position for a couple of the muscles involved. All right, well, from a muscle growth perspective, that's a very, very positive thing if we're going to start repping it. Okay. Also, we come over to the point of how many muscles are involved. There's a lot of muscles involved. All right, the other thing, when we start talking recovery, that's the other thing people knock the deadlift on is the stimulus to fatigue. They're like, it's very fatiguing relative to the amount of muscle stimulus you get because of the big weights involved, right? The axial loading. That's usually one of the cases I make against the trap bar, right? It's the stimulus to fatigue is terrible on that thing. All right, when we go to a deficit though, we're forced to use a slightly lighter weight. All right, so from a fatigue perspective, if we can't lift quite as much weight, let's say 5% less. Hey, let's say your, whatever, your 10 rep max is 400, on a normal deadlift, right? And when you do a 10 rep max with a deficit, it might only be 380, right? It's gonna be probably say 5% lower, right? All right, that's less fatigue. On the stimulus end, we've added range of motion into the lengthened position. We're putting, with a slightly lighter weight, we can put the same mechanical tension on a muscle, or with the same weight, greater mechanical tension because of the joint angles involved. So what does this mean from a muscle growth perspective? Better stimulus, less fatigue than a normal deadlift. Well, this makes the deadlift a little more viable. So, a perfect example here, like on some of these, what you see me doing, this is ranging a couple different sets, 6 reps, 8 reps, whatever, with 500 pounds. So on the ones where I'm doing 8 reps, stop and think about that from a muscle growth perspective. 8 reps with 500 pounds on a deficit deadlift. Now that has a hell of a growth stimulus, okay? You talk about a movement pattern and just a single work set like that, of how much muscle mass does that stimulate? And it's a lot of those muscles that make you thicker. They just make you look thicker. Top to bottom, not necessarily just your pecs and triceps and biceps, but all the muscles of your back, glutes, hamstrings, traps, forearms. All of that stuff is getting worked tremendously. An enormous amount of workload just hit those muscles. Okay? Now it's still high fatigue. This is still an extremely high fatigue. You're not going to do a whole lot of volume with this, but you don't need a lot. Okay? 1 or 2 really, really hard sets on a deficit deadlift like this as part of your workout will add significant amounts of muscle growth through, muscles all the way from your traps all the way down to the hamstrings and calves potentially. All right, this is a phenomenal way to get thick. It's a reason I love this exercise. It brings so much to the table. Now, the thing is, it is difficult, right? It is difficult, particularly as you start to get strong. But it is a fantastic tool. It is something I love to use in my training toolbox, something I use for a lot of my clients, something I use for myself, not necessarily for all of them. It brings a lot to the table. And if you're looking for something that is just brutal and basic, because it really is a basic movement, consider using deficit deadlifts. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.